The House of Commons has just witnessed scenes of absolute chaos that political insiders are calling the most dramatic collapse of government authority in modern British history. Just 3 minutes ago, Keir Starmer completely lost control in front of stunned MPs as the no-confidence motion was formally triggered against his leadership. His face turned scarlet, his voice cracked with rage, and for the first time since taking power, the man who always projects calm superiority was caught on camera in a state of pure panic. What you're about to discover goes far beyond a simple political disagreement. This is about the systematic betrayal of 17 million voters and the deliberate destruction of everything Brexit was supposed to deliver. The establishment media is already working overtime to bury this story, but we're going to expose every single detail they're desperate to hide. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how Starmer's secret surrender to Brussels has triggered the biggest political earthquake Britain has seen in decades, and why the next 72 hours could determine whether British democracy survives or dies forever. The timing of this explosion inside Westminster could not be more devastating for Keir Starmer. Sources inside Downing Street have revealed that the Prime Minister was completely blindsided by the scale of the rebellion, now erupting from within his own party. He genuinely believed he could negotiate away Britain's sovereignty piece by piece without anyone noticing what he was doing. He thought the British people were too distracted to pay attention to the bureaucratic fine print of his deals with Brussels, and he assumed that Labour MPs would fall in line out of loyalty, even as he systematically betrayed everything they campaigned on during the last election. Every single one of those assumptions has now been proven catastrophically wrong. The no-confidence motion that has just been triggered represents the ultimate rejection of Starmer's leadership by the very people who are supposed to support him. This isn't coming from opposition benches where criticism is expected and routine. This rebellion is erupting from inside the Labour Party itself, from MPs who stood on doorsteps promising voters that their government would be different, that they would respect the referendum result, that they would serve the British people rather than Brussels bureaucrats. The specific moment when everything fell apart for Starmer has been captured on video, and the footage is already spreading like wildfire across social media. During Prime Minister's questions, a backbench Labour MP rose to directly challenge Starmer about the fishing rights agreement he just signed with the European Union. The MP, representing a coastal constituency where fishing communities have been devastated by EU policies, asked why the Prime Minister had handed British territorial waters back to foreign vessels until 2038. The question was straightforward and demanded a clear answer, but instead of responding with facts and figures, instead of defending his decision with reasoned argument, Starmer completely lost his composure in front of the entire chamber. His response was angry, defensive, and revealed a man who knows he's been caught doing something he cannot justify. He accused his own backbencher of not understanding the complexity of international negotiations. He claimed that criticism of his Brussels deal was playing into the hands of extremists. And then he made the fatal mistake that has now sealed his political fate. He told the MP to sit down and stop embarrassing the party with questions that help the opposition. The reaction inside the House of Commons was instant and electric. Labour MPs on both sides of the chamber visibly recoiled at their leader's words. Opposition members erupted in shouts, demanding Starmer withdraw his attack on his own colleague. The Speaker had to intervene multiple times to restore order, as the session descended into complete chaos. But the real damage wasn't happening in the chamber itself. The real catastrophe for Starmer was unfolding in Labour WhatsApp groups and private meetings, where furious MPs were realising their leader had just revealed his true character to millions of watching voters. Within 30 minutes of that exchange, senior Labour figures were already making contact with each other to discuss what had previously been unthinkable. They were talking about removing their own Prime Minister before he could drag the entire party down to electoral annihilation. The fishing rights agreement that triggered this meltdown represents just one piece of Starmer's broader surrender to the European Union. But it's the piece that ordinary British people can understand most clearly. Brexit was supposed to mean taking back control of British waters. Coastal communities were promised that European boats would lose their automatic access to fishing grounds that belonged to Britain. Fishermen were assured that after decades of watching foreign vessels take fish from their territorial waters, they would finally have priority in their own country. Every single one of those promises has now been broken by a Prime Minister who campaigned on respecting the Brexit mandate. Starmer has handed EU fishing fleets guaranteed access to British waters for another 12 years. That's 12 more years of Spanish trawlers, French boats and Dutch vessels operating in waters that voted overwhelmingly to leave the European Union, specifically to end this arrangement. The fishing communities that trusted Brexit are now being told their vote meant nothing and their concerns don't matter. But the fishing betrayal is just the beginning of what critics are calling the most comprehensive surrender of British sovereignty since the country originally joined the European Union in 1973. The regulatory alignment agreement that Starmer negotiated means Britain must now follow whatever rules Brussels decides to impose on food standards, agriculture policy and environmental regulations. British businesses will have no say in creating these rules. British consumers will have no choice about the standards that determine what products appear in their shops. And British courts will have no final authority when disputes arise about how these regulations should be interpreted. The European Court of Justice, the very institution that Brexit was specifically designed to free Britain from, now has jurisdiction over critical aspects of British economic life. This isn't taking back control. This is handing control to unelected foreign judges while pretending that nothing fundamental has changed. Starmer promised voters he would make Brexit work. What he's actually delivered is Brexit in name only, with all the costs of leaving, but none of the benefits of genuine sovereignty. The youth mobility scheme currently being negotiated between Starmer's government and Brussels represents perhaps the most dangerous element of this entire surrender package. The official line from Downing Street is that this is simply a cultural exchange programme, allowing young people to travel and work temporarily in each other's countries. They insist it has nothing to do with freedom of movement. They promise there will be strict limits and controls to prevent any abuse of the system. But analysis of what the European Union is actually demanding tells a completely different story that the government desperately wants to hide from public scrutiny. EU negotiators are pushing for a scheme with no numerical caps whatsoever. They want any person aged 18 to 30 from any of the 27 member states to have an automatic right to live and work in Britain. They are demanding that participants in this scheme have pathways to permanent settlement rather than being required to return home after a fixed period. When you calculate the total number of people across all EU countries who would become eligible under these terms, you reach the staggering figure of over 60 million individuals who could potentially claim the right to move to Britain. Reform UK has seized on these revelations with devastating effectiveness, and their message is cutting through to millions of voters who feel betrayed by the entire political establishment. Nigel Farage appeared on national television just hours after Starmer's meltdown in the Commons and delivered what observers are calling the most powerful political speech of his entire career. He looked directly into the camera and spoke to the 17 million people who voted for Brexit with a message that combined righteous anger with cold political calculation. He reminded them that they were promised their vote would be respected. He showed them evidence that Starmer has systematically broken every commitment made about Brexit. And then he made a promise that has electrified British politics and terrified everyone in Westminster who thought they could reverse the referendum result without consequences. Farage promised that Reform UK will win the next general election, will tear up every surrender agreement Starmer has signed, and will deliver the real Brexit that voters were promised 8 years ago. The polling numbers that are now emerging paint a picture of electoral devastation so complete that even seasoned political analysts are struggling to find historical parallels. Reform UK has surged to 42% in the latest survey, conducted just hours after Starmer's furious outburst in Parliament. Labour has collapsed to just 18%, a catastrophic drop that represents the fastest decline in support for any governing party in modern British history. The Conservative Party is languishing at 15%, essentially tied with the Liberal Democrats and facing potential extinction as a meaningful political force. These aren't normal polling fluctuations driven by temporary events that will be forgotten next week. These numbers represent a fundamental realignment of British politics, triggered by the establishment's decision to betray the democratic mandate delivered in the Brexit referendum. Voters are making clear that they will punish anyone who treats their decision with contempt. And right now, that punishment is being directed with laser focus at Keir Starmer and everyone associated with his government. The May local elections, now just weeks away, are shaping up to be an absolute bloodbath for Labour that could trigger Starmer's removal even before a general election becomes necessary. The internal warfare inside the Labour Party has now escalated to levels that insiders describe as completely unprecedented in the party's entire history. Cabinet ministers are briefing journalists against each other in increasingly personal terms. Backbench MPs are forming rival groups based on whether they want Starmer replaced immediately or think he should be allowed to limp on until after the local elections. The Parliamentary Labour Party meeting that took place this morning descended into shouting matches and recriminations as MPs from Leave voting constituencies confronted their leadership about the Brussels surrender. One representative from the North East reportedly stood up and told Starmer directly that his Brexit betrayal will cost her seat at the next election, and she refuses to go down defending policies she never believed in. Another MP from the Midlands accused the Prime Minister of treating working-class voters like idiots who wouldn't notice what he was doing. The meeting was supposed to last 1 hour, but was cut short after just 30 minutes, when it became clear that no reconciliation was possible between Starmer and the MPs who feel he has destroyed their political futures. Health Secretary Wes Streeting has emerged as the clear frontrunner to replace Starmer if and when the leadership challenge becomes official. His allies have been working the phones constantly since yesterday's Commons meltdown, gauging support among backbenchers and building the coalition needed to mount a successful challenge. Streeting's pitch to wavering MPs is brutally pragmatic and focused entirely on electoral survival. He argues that Starmer has become toxic with voters and cannot possibly win the next general election. He promises that under his leadership, Labour would take a harder line on immigration and border control, issues where the party has hemorrhaged support to Reform UK. He suggests that some elements of the Brussels agreement could be renegotiated or even scrapped entirely if they prove politically untenable. Most importantly, he offers MPs a lifeline to save their seats by distancing themselves from Starmer's most unpopular decisions before voters deliver their verdict. The question facing Labour representatives is whether this strategy can work or whether the damage is already so severe that changing leaders would simply rearrange deck chairs on a sinking ship. Greater Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham represents a different faction within Labour that believes the party needs to return to its working class roots rather than simply changing the face at the top. Burnham has been careful not to directly attack Starmer in public, but his recent speeches have contained barely disguised criticism of the government's direction. He spoke yesterday about the importance of respecting referendum results, even when you personally disagreed with the outcome. He emphasised that democracy means accepting decisions made by ordinary people, rather than looking for clever ways to reverse them. And he warned that political parties which treat voters with contempt will be punished severely at the ballot box. Everyone who heard these remarks understood they were aimed squarely at Starmer's Brussels surrender. Burnham's supporters believe he could unite the traditional Labour vote with enough Leave voters to prevent complete electoral collapse. The problem is that Burnham currently sits outside Parliament, which creates constitutional complications for any leadership bid. But Labour is now so desperate that MPs are actively discussing rule changes that would allow him to stand for leader without being a sitting member of the Commons. That's how terrified they are of facing voters with Starmer still in charge. The European Union's response to the chaos engulfing British politics has been carefully calibrated to avoid appearing to interfere in domestic affairs while still protecting the gains they secured from Starmer. EU officials have made clear through unofficial briefings that they consider the agreements already signed to be binding, regardless of what happens to the current government. They warn that any attempt to tear up these deals would have serious consequences for Britain's relationship with the bloc and could trigger retaliatory measures affecting British businesses operating in European markets. This is exactly the kind of threat that infuriates Brexit supporters, who voted specifically to free Britain from European blackmail. The message from Brussels seems designed to shore up Starmer's position by making clear that replacing him won't automatically reverse his surrender. But this strategy could backfire spectacularly if it convinces British voters that their democracy is being held hostage by foreign powers who believe they can dictate terms to a sovereign nation. Nigel Farage has already seized on these EU statements as proof that the establishment conspiracy to destroy Brexit extends far beyond Westminster and involves coordination between British politicians and European bureaucrats who share contempt for ordinary voters. The constitutional experts who have examined Starmer's negotiating process are raising serious questions about whether proper parliamentary procedures were followed. Under Britain's unwritten constitution, major changes to the country's international relationships are supposed to involve meaningful parliamentary scrutiny before agreements are finalised. MPs should have opportunities to debate the terms, suggest amendments, and vote on whether to authorise the government to proceed. But the evidence suggests that Starmer's team deliberately bypassed these conventions by characterising the Brussels negotiations as technical arrangements rather than fundamental policy changes. They avoided triggering the mechanisms that would have required parliamentary votes by structuring the deals as modifications to existing frameworks rather than entirely new agreements. This legalistic approach may have been technically permissible, but it violates the spirit of democratic governance and shows clear intent to prevent MPs from blocking what Starmer knew would be deeply unpopular with voters. The fact that such important decisions affecting British sovereignty were made without proper democratic oversight is itself a scandal that demands accountability, regardless of what anyone thinks about the specific policies involved. The whistleblowers inside the civil service who have been leaking details of Starmer's secret negotiations with Brussels are now coming forward with even more damaging revelations about how this betrayal was planned from the very beginning. Documents obtained by investigative journalists show that senior Labour advisers held at least 6 confidential meetings with European Commission officials between January and June of 2024. Months before the general election that brought Starmer to power. These meetings covered every aspect of what would later become the surrender package, including fishing rights, regulatory alignment, court jurisdiction, and the youth mobility scheme. The Labour representatives attending these sessions made clear that their party was willing to offer Brussels everything they wanted in exchange for what they called a reset of the relationship. None of these discussions were disclosed to British voters during the election campaign. None of these commitments appeared in Labour's manifesto, and none of these deals were debated in Parliament before Starmer began implementing them after taking office. The British people were deliberately kept in the dark about what their potential government was planning because Starmer knew the truth would cost him votes he needed to win power. The specific timeline documented in these leaked files is absolutely devastating for anyone who still believes Starmer had good intentions. In February 2024, Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary met with EU negotiators in Brussels to discuss the framework for future cooperation. The European officials presented a list of demands that included continued access to British fishing waters, alignment with EU regulations on food and agriculture, acceptance of European court jurisdiction in specific areas, and a youth mobility scheme with minimal restrictions. The Labour representative didn't push back on any of these demands or suggest they would be politically difficult to deliver. Instead, according to the leaked minutes, he indicated that a future Labour government would be flexible on all these points and was committed to finding solutions that satisfied Brussels. This was 4 months before the election, when Labour was still telling British voters they would make Brexit work and respect the referendum result. The gap between what they were promising the public and what they were offering to Europe in private represents a level of deception that should shock anyone who believes politicians have any obligation to be honest with the people they seek to govern. Dominic Cummings has responded to these leaks by publishing a lengthy analysis on social media that connects the dots between various establishment figures who have been working to undermine Brexit since the referendum. He names specific permanent secretaries inside government departments who have consistently sabotaged attempts to implement genuine divergence from European regulations. He identifies journalists who have coordinated with these officials to publish stories designed to make Brexit appear chaotic and unworkable. He exposes think tanks and academic institutions that received EU funding while producing research arguing that Britain should seek closer alignment with Brussels. And he places Starmer at the centre of this web as the political frontman who promised to complete what the establishment had been attempting for years. Cummings warns that these same networks are now plotting to destroy Nigel Farage and Reform UK before they can win power and deliver the real Brexit that voters demanded. He provides specific examples of how officials have already begun gathering opposition research on Farage and his key supporters. He reveals that meetings have been held to discuss potential legal obstacles that could be thrown in Reform's path if they win the next election. This isn't conspiracy theory speculation from someone on the fringes of politics. This is a detailed exposé from the man who masterminded the original Brexit victory and understands exactly how the establishment operates when it feels threatened. The fishing communities that have been most directly betrayed by Starmer's surrender are now organising politically in ways that could have massive electoral consequences. The Scottish Fishermen's Federation has announced it will be actively campaigning against Labour candidates in the upcoming local elections and any future general election. Federation chairman has given media interviews describing the emotional devastation felt by families who have worked these waters for generations and are now being told that foreign vessels have more rights than they do. He spoke about fishermen who voted Labour their entire lives, believing the party represented working people, who now feel completely abandoned by politicians who care more about pleasing Brussels than protecting British livelihoods. These aren't abstract political debates happening in Westminster committee rooms. These are real people whose businesses and communities are being destroyed by decisions made in secret, without any consultation with those who will bear the consequences. The fishing industry employs relatively small numbers compared to other sectors, but its symbolic importance to Brexit cannot be overstated. When voters see fishermen being betrayed after being promised that Brexit meant taking back control of British waters, they understand that if the government will break promises to these communities, they will break promises to everyone. The welfare reforms that Starmer's government has been pushing through Parliament have added another layer of fury to the rebellion now consuming the Labour Party. These reforms, which will push an estimated 400,000 people into poverty, according to independent analysis, are being implemented at the same time as Starmer hands billions in additional contributions to the European Union as part of his surrender package. The optics of this combination are absolutely catastrophic for a party that claims to represent working people. Labour MPs from constituencies with high levels of deprivation are being asked to vote for cutting support to their own constituents while the Prime Minister signs agreements that benefit Brussels. Several representatives have privately told colleagues they simply cannot defend this to voters who are already struggling with the cost of living crisis. The disconnect between Labour's supposed values and their actual policies in government has never been more stark or more politically damaging. Even MPs who support closer ties with Europe are beginning to question whether Starmer's approach makes any sense when it requires them to inflict pain on their own voters while handing concessions to foreign powers. The Conservative Party has attempted to capitalise on Labour's chaos, but their own involvement in previous Brexit compromises severely limits their credibility on this issue. Shadow ministers have been hammering Starmer over his Brussels surrender in Parliament and media appearances. They demand full transparency about every agreement that has been negotiated. They call for parliamentary votes on each element so that MPs can be held accountable by their constituents. But whenever Conservatives make these arguments, Labour responds by pointing out that previous Tory governments also made compromises with the EU and failed to deliver the clean break that Brexit voters wanted. This mutual recrimination between the two traditional parties has created the perfect environment for Reform UK to surge by positioning themselves as the only party that has been consistently honest about wanting genuine separation from Brussels. Farage can credibly claim that both Labour and Conservative establishments have betrayed Brexit and that only his party will actually deliver what 17 million people voted for. This message is devastatingly effective because it's essentially true, and neither of the old parties has any convincing response.